right there on our calendar to make it super easy. This series has been a collaboration of the Burlington Public Library, Tewksbury Public Library, and Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover. I would like to thank the Friends group of each of these three libraries for generously sponsoring this series. Tonight's program is titled Georgio O'Keeffe, Beyond the Blossoms, and I'm happy to introduce Jane Oneail. Jane is the owner and creator of Culturally Curious, an arts education firm that curates and delivers engaging art talks to audiences throughout New England. She's an independent scholar and holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in art in education from Harvard University. Jane is a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Courier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. If you have a question for Jane, type it in the chat and she will answer it at the end of the program. And thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Jane.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me back, Marnie. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Georgia O'Keeffe and her body of work. So, so we are in for such a treat. We've got a jam-packed hour ahead of us. And I will be honest, this is the debut of this program. So we'll see just how good I am at sticking to that hour. So we've got this gorgeous image by Georgia O'Keeffe on the screen. We're actually not going to circle back to this one tonight, but it gives us a good sort of taste. It whets our appetite for some of the really modern, wonderful images that we'll be seeing tonight. Now, we're here to look at the life and the work of really the world's most famous woman artist. And everybody's familiar with her flowers. They're gorgeous, but they really only represent about 10% of her body of work. And so there's a lot more of Georgia O'Keeffe for us to get familiar with. So let's dive right in. We're going beyond the blossoms, but I had to give you a flower fix. We're going to start off with just a few of them. This is the resplendent red canna from 1924, which is in a private collection. It's a truly intimate look at a flower, and it's painted on a monumental scale. It's nearly 30 inches tall. And we see every ripple, every fold, the undulating lines that lead us to new colors, the reds, the yellows, the oranges and lavenders. And with each sort of passage through these colors, we see new forms. So what we're looking at here reminds us of our own experiences with flowers, but also of the very archetype of a flower, our best possible imagined flower. And it's all described in such crisp detail, real clarity here. It's just truly gorgeous. Now, it is worth mentioning sort of where all of this falls in the history of art, because it's not just beautiful, of course, but we have this tradition in art history that oftentimes florals, still lifes, botanical drawings, that sort of thing, are sort of relegated to the women's sphere. And this is true going back centuries. It's not exclusively true, but it's a tendency, I'll put it that way. We are looking at a gorgeous still life painting by the Dutch Baroque artist, Rachel Ruysch, which dates to about 1700 over here on the left. So the most famous woman painter derives her fame from painting a traditionally feminine subject. Would she have been so successful or so popular today if she had never painted a flower? Something for us to consider. If if she hadn't fit into this sort of preordained mold of what society had expected for women, especially working women. So we'll see throughout the program tonight that O'Keeffe's she had very relatable struggles when it comes to expectations for women and her finding her own independence, really. Her life is in so many ways the embodiment of the very modern challenges of how women negotiate careers and families and men in their lives. So it's worth noting that O'Keeffe never wanted to be known as a female artist. She just wanted to be known as an artist. But I think fully appreciating her successes and her setbacks means acknowledging what she was up against, really, as a woman in a male-dominated field. And let's not forget, when she started painting, she was legally a second-class citizen. Women had not yet gotten the right to vote. So one last flower painting before we get to the heart of the program tonight. The flower paintings, it's worth saying, they're irresistible. And the monumentality of them makes them really sort of unexpected. There was an art critic who saw them early on, who sort of suggested that when we look at these large paintings of flowers, it makes us feel small as humans. He said, it makes us feel like butterflies. And I love that notion. So this is two Calla lilies on pink from 1928 on the left, and on the right, we have white iris from 1930. O'Keeffe said, when you take a flower in your hand and really look at it, it's your world for the moment. I want to give that world to someone else. Most people in the city rush around, so they have no time to look at a flower. I want them to see it whether they want to or not. So this is our opportunity tonight to take time and cherish the things that we normally overlook. And flower paintings definitely got Georgia O'Keeffe noticed. She was incredibly successful because of them. She sold a series of 6 paintings in 1928, and she earned, in the equivalent of today's money, more than $300,000 for them, which was the highest amount ever paid to an American artist at the time. Not a bad payday for her. So let's get started looking at the other facets of her career. I love this photographic portrait of her. This is by her husband here in 1932, and we'll get to know him a little bit too. So here's the way we'll move through tonight's program. We're going to start off with an introduction to the artist. We'll look at some of her work in New York that roughly aligns to like the 1920s. And then we'll take a look at the work that she produced in New Mexico, which was really where her heart was for most of the rest of her life. We'll wrap up with some of her experiments in a variety of media other than painting, and then finish up with some of her late works and her legacy. So a lot to cover tonight. All right, so just to get us all situated here, our artist was born in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin in 1887. This was actually the house that she was born in, and she was the oldest daughter in a set of 7 children. She was the second born, and we see her at the center here pictured with 2 of her younger sisters. And as a young person, she showed an early inclination in the arts. She wanted to draw, she wanted to paint. And so as a teenager, she received instruction in that, as well as a few of her siblings too. So this is a very early drawing from the artist. It dates to around the age 13 for her. And we see her in a later photograph over here, working with some of her materials. So by the early years of the 1900s, she is frequently traveling, sometimes for her education, sometimes because her family was moving, but she's basically crisscrossing all over the United States. She's going from Illinois to Texas to Virginia to South Carolina and New York City. And during this time, she's also pursuing a formal education as an artist. She attended the school at the Art Institute of Chicago, as well as the Art Students League in New York City. And after that, she did a little bit of commercial work, but it seemed, and I should say that she did a lot of teaching as an artist too, but it seemed like a lot of her big endeavors were oftentimes derailed due to poor health. So she would kind of start something and then have to move home to kind of recuperate. She had typhoid fever and measles at 2 separate times. So grappling with a lot here, but art was always at the forefront. Ooh. So between the years 1912 and 1916, she took summer classes at the University of Virginia. And these were special classes because the university, as I understand it, the University of Virginia was not a co-ed school at this time. So these summer classes were just for women art instructors. And not only did she take a few of them, towards the end, she started teaching them. And while she was there, she was exposed to the ideas of Arthur Wesley Dow, who was an artist and art educator. And what she learned from his philosophies was basically that art doesn't necessarily have to involve copying things, which was really how artists have been trained up until this point. It's like you look at something, you try to replicate it on canvas or on a sheet of paper. So Dow's ideas really freed her. He essentially expressed that art was about design, art was about composition. So there's adding that creative layer to things that really frees up Georgia O'Keeffe in her studies. And so we begin to see a little bit of his ideas bleeding into her drawings and her paintings while she's on campus at the University of Virginia. I really like well, we see the rotunda over here on the left, but I really like this abstracted work from, I think, a couple years later, where we see, the trees simply rendered here. But we see in both of these too, this inclination to compose a picture with this kind of strict symmetry to it. She's always really loved symmetry. And of course, this tendency towards abstraction and the simplification of forms. All right, so following this, there's a momentous decision in her life, and that is she sent a few of her drawings, charcoal drawings, to a friend of hers, who then sent them off to a gallery in New York City. And these images ended up in the hands of the gallery owner, a man by the name of Alfred Stieglitz. And I should mention that the two images that we're looking at here were created in 1915, 1916. And we see that they're really innovative in terms of their design and their abstraction, the kind of use of these biomorphic forms that we see in both of these images. And this is O'Keeffe from right at this time in her life too. So the pictures are sent off to this gallery and this gallery owner, and he happens to be really the most influential leader in modern art in America. He was a photographer, but he was kind of helping the careers of so many others. And he was taken by them. So Alfred Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe begin a relationship of letters, and they continue to correspond even after they meet each other. They continue to correspond for the next 30 years. And when all is said and done, they've exchanged 25,000 pages between each other. So there's a real connection, like a soul connection between these two. So if seeing her drawings was sort of the seed that started the relationship, it's really their letter writing that kind of seals the deal. She wrote to him before she'd even met him, "I'm getting to like you so tremendously that it sometimes scares me. Having told you so much of me, more than anyone else I know, could anything else follow but that I should want you?" Now, things are going pretty well there. Stieglitz is then inspired really to include Georgia O'Keeffe's works in several exhibitions at his gallery. Now let's meet her future husband, Alfred Stieglitz. We see him in a photograph from 1915 over here on the left, and a photograph of him standing in his gallery over on the right. Now, he was, like I said, a photographer who played this really important role in the history of photography in America. He was the person that helped everybody essentially understand that photography could be an art form. It wasn't just a tool to use to document something. you can make an artful picture. And along with that, he was helping to showcase and exhibit modern works. First, he started off with European works in his little gallery called the 291 Gallery. He exhibited works by Matisse, Rodin, Picasso, Cézanne, and then he moved on to some American painters, including John Marin, Arthur Dove, and Marsden Hartley. But he wasn't necessarily the easiest person to get along with. One art historian said Stieglitz was an immensely charismatic person, amazingly egotistical and narcissistic, but he had this ability to establish a deep communion with people. So there's one other wrinkle in this relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe, and that was that Alfred Stieglitz was married and he was 23 years older than young Georgia O'Keeffe. But that doesn't stop them. In 1918, Stieglitz decides to underwrite a year of painting for Georgia O'Keeffe. And by that, I mean, he helps her move to New York City and he pays for her to live there and paint. Within weeks of her arrival in New York City, Stieglitz, who's 54, leaves his wife to be with Georgia O'Keeffe, who is 31. And she is kind of blossoming under his attention. And clearly he's photographing her too. And she talked about this sharp eye that he had with his camera, but in how later on in life, looking back at these images that he created, she doesn't even quite know who this person was. So, so as someone who had kind of traditionally frail health. When she moved to New York City in 1918, she had this mysterious illness. Many people think that she had the Spanish flu at that time. So she was a little bit of an invalid. And Stieglitz had this role of taking care of her. So there was already this kind of interesting power dynamic at play in their relationship. So he's her guardian, he's nursing her back to health, he's providing housing for her. And so the intensity of this connection escalates, and the intensity and the sexuality of the images he creates of her begin to escalate too. These are more photographs by Stieglitz from 1918 and 1919. He loved to emphasize her hands in many photographs because she had these long, beautiful fingers, very expressive. And then not too long later, the clothes come off. And he exhibited these photographs and several other nudes of Georgia O'Keeffe in an exhibition of his photography in 1921. And let's just put it this way, it created a sensation. Even years later, Georgia O'Keeffe said that he photographed her with a kind of heat. Now, in the same way that nude photographs can launch people into stardom today, the same is true for Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, remember, photography is not a new process, but art photography is still relatively new. And there were not many nude photographs like this available for public viewing in respectable settings. And we should also remember that even in recent memory, sexual fine art photography can create huge controversies. Think of Mapplethorpe. And we just don't really see this happen in other media. You can paint a nude and people don't go so crazy. So these images of Georgia O'Keeffe certainly helped to get her noticed. In fact, I would say they kind of launched her into stardom. A star is born. So then what happens? Alfred Stieglitz begins exhibiting her work every single year, starting in 1923, going all the way to his death in 1946. So these works were included in his exhibition that included his name, Alfred Stieglitz Presents 100 Pictures, Oils, Watercolors, Pastels, Drawings by Georgia O'Keeffe. And so these give us a little taste of what's to come with her. They're tranquil, they're sort of simplified scenes, and they have these kind of soft and sensual lines. These landscapes are inspired by her visit to Lake George, where a lot of his family lived. So following this exhibition, the two of them were married. Alfred Stieglitz's divorce was finally finalized, and do they live happily ever after? Well, I will just give you this note to contemplate. It was actually Alfred Stieglitz, her husband, who put forward the Freudian theory that her flower paintings are actually close studies of female anatomy. And he started talking about that in 1919. And that's an idea that she just denied, flat out denied for decades. But he planted that idea. And I think to this day, if you're sitting next to somebody tonight, you can even look over at them and, you know, their eyebrows might be raised, their cheeks might be a little pinker. Looking at images like this, we have white and blue flower shapes from 1919 on the left, that's at the O'Keeffe Museum, and Jack in the Pulpit from 1930 at the National Gallery of Art. These are erotic images; they're sensual images. So, so he had a big role in shaping the way she was perceived and launched, really too. So, so that really raises the debate in terms of who is allowed to produce knowledge and whose opinions matter the most. So we'll end this introduction to the artist with this great photograph of the couple by the photographer Ansel Adams. This is from 1939. And we'll get back to this interesting partnership. But for now, let's turn our attention to some of the images that O'Keeffe produced following their marriage. So we're going to focus on New York City. Stieglitz and O'Keeffe moved into the Shelton Hotel. They were living on the 30th floor. The year that it was built, it was the tallest building in the world. And she was one of the very first Americans to live in a skyscraper. And she talked about, you know, the vantage point, that special vantage point of being able to live in a skyscraper. That said, she painted a lot of skyscrapers from below. So this is one of her first. This is called New York Street with Moon from 1925. This is in a collection in Spain. And what are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at a cluster of buildings here that are like monoliths. They don't have any windows. They don't have any doors. They are just these big, impressive masses here. And almost all of them have these kind of curved cornices, kind of coming over into our space just a little bit. Underneath them, we have an electric street light that has this beautiful sort of white yellow glow to it. And just underneath that is a red stoplight. In the distance, we can see the sun is setting and we see a traditional church spire here. You almost get the sense that it's the sun setting on a different time, a different era in American history. But our eyes really get drawn up to the top of this canvas here, where we see the moon peeking out behind these kind of rippling, lovely clouds here. And those ripples, of course, remind me of her flowers. And I think we'll see Georgio O'Keeffe really struggles to unify organic and man-made forms in these New York City paintings. It's always something that she's striving towards. But let's keep in mind that that skyscrapers were a symbol of American ingenuity, American modernity. And here she is as a female artist just taking this on, but she's trying to find a way to make it her own. So here she's painting her own residence. This is the Sheldon Hotel from the following year, 1926. And once again, she's looking at it from below and she's integrating this kind of visual effect here, the sunspots. So the sun is actually kind of taking a bite out of this massive form. We see more rippling effects in the background. This time it's like city steam or smoke. And then we have the wonderful visual play of all of these yellow sunspots that are seemingly kind of dancing around the surface of this picture. This time we get a couple of windows included, but it's just kind of abstract patterning at this point. This isn't true observed reality in terms of the depiction of the Shelton Hotel. So once again, we're finding this kind of good balance between the natural and the man-made. And I'll just remind you really quickly too, in terms of how she's leaning on and still developing those ideas from Arthur Wesley Dow that she had first learned about a decade earlier. And so we still see that emphasis on symmetry, on abstraction, and on design. This next work is one that that you don't see as often. It's called City Night from 1926. It's at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And we can see here a really kind of different approach to painting a skyscraper. This is an overwhelming view. It's foreboding. It's looming. It's this kind of cavernous scene. It almost feels like these skyscrapers could crush you. Once again, we don't get the details of the building. We simply get this looming mass here. And Georgio O'Keeffe once said, "You can't paint New York as it is, but rather how it felt." And here in this picture, we actually get a vertical convergence, meaning if the vertical lines of these skyscrapers were to be extended, they would actually intersect. So she's actually replicating here an effect that you would get by taking a photograph looking up at this. So it shows that she's very familiar with modern photography at this point, but also willing to make these kind of design choices for impact. And I love that she's included a little bit of hope in these, in the star up above and the electric light down below. I think it's a really gorgeous image. This is also a good place to just introduce the idea of precisionism. This is oftentimes the art historical term that you hear when people are talking about Georgio O'Keeffe's work. And that typically means that she's using really sort of smooth, polished brushwork in order to convey her subject, really crisp, clear lines. And I bring in work by the American Impressionist Child Hassam, a view of New York City over here from about a decade earlier, where we can see there's like this flurry of broken, visible brushstrokes here. With Precisionism, the goal is the opposite end of the spectrum. It's almost similar to what we think of as like commercial work today. So there's a crispness, a clarity to it. Now, Georgio O'Keeffe did paint from her apartment occasionally. And this is a really interesting comparison because we've got a photograph by her husband over here on the left and one of her paintings over on the right. So you can see that that his framing here, which and he did take his well, actually, I'm not entirely sure if he took his photograph first. I'm assuming he took his photograph first, but his framing, his interest in the subject matter is replicated in her painting. And so we get this really kind of tonal quality to this picture. It's almost monochromatic, right? And even though we're looking at this kind of industrial landscape, we've got the smokestacks and these long, low buildings, there's this mix of the natural world here with all of the smoke and the steam and the rain here. So this picture, when I look at it, just doesn't sing to me in the same way that her skyscrapers do. And I almost get the sense that Georgio O'Keeffe is trying to fit a square peg into a round hole by working in dialogue with her husband here. So even though they might have been on the same page artistically, there were cracks in their relationship at this time, namely that she was interested and ready to have children, but he already had one child from his previous marriage and he was not going to have any more. And as everybody here probably knows, that can be the end of a lot of relationships. But here, just a quick peek when she re-engages with this subject matter about a year later, you can see that she makes it her own. She brings in some color. She adds some sunspots to it, creates that same visual effect that we saw with the Shelton Hotel, makes the river glow red here, and I think creates a really interesting picture. This one is at the New Jersey State Museum collection. So once again, we see her kind of blending the natural and the man-made. So the last New York City picture I want to share with you is oftentimes considered her best, her most triumphant. This is the Radiator Building from 1927, and it's at the Crystal Bridges Museum down in Arkansas. So we've got this gorgeous kind of Art Deco Gothic skyscraper here with that specific style top here, and this incredible play of electric light. We've got the windows lit up throughout the building. We've got a few windows lit up in other buildings. We've got got the glow of these street lamps down below, but they're disembodied. They're just kind of hovering there. I absolutely love it. Then we've got almost like searchlights in the background, dividing up this space and illuminating the steam coming off of the top of this other skyscraper, turning it a little bit green. So we've got some yellow, some green, some blue, and then a little bit of red over here where we have a sign lit up to say Alfred Stieglitz, which of course the sign did not exist in New York City at the time, but because she decided to include it, a lot of people think of it as like a double portrait of her and her husband. And some people think of the building itself as representing her. I have to say, I think that these organic elements, these kind of wispy, willowy, rippling elements here probably represent her best. And that would be a really nice balance here. So, so throughout the 1920s, these skyscrapers are this signal in terms of the American success story. But by the time we get to 1929 and the crash of the stock market on Wall Street, skyscrapers sort of begin to symbolize the failure of the American experiment in so many ways. And it also kind of coincides with Georgio O'Keeffe's increased dissatisfaction of living in the city. So what do you do then? You go on an adventure and you head west. So let's go to New Mexico with Georgio O'Keeffe. So this year, 1929, marks this very critical stage of development in her work. Her images become cleaner and sharper, and she begins to use even more simplified forms. And at this time already, Georgio O'Keeffe is really one of the most popular and most important artists working in America. And as we'll see, New Mexico speaks to her. Just a quick quote from her. She said, I loved it immediately. From then on, I was always on my way back. So let's take a look at what was speaking to her. This is a painting that she created in 1930. It's called The Black Mesa Landscape, New Mexico. She said, when I got to New Mexico, that was mine. As soon as I saw it, that was my country. I'd never seen anything like it before, but it fitted to me exactly. So it was a space that spoke to her. She's drawn to these wide open spaces, the bold light, the dramatic coloring of the Southwestern landscape. And she draws our eyes to these ravines and ruts in these hills in the foreground. And look at the colors she's using in this landscape too. We've got this orangey peach, a little bit of green in the foreground, but these hills are almost like a fleshy color here, right? I mean, who thinks of desert landscapes as being so sensual? But I think that there is a very sensual quality to this specific landscape. Some lavender, some black, and then these purple mountains in the background. Her use of color here is absolutely gorgeous. And we can see she has found these organic forms that she has been dying to paint throughout the 1920s. While she's there on her first visit, she paints a church. Actually, she paints it a number of times. We're looking at the back of the Ranchos Church, and this is Ranchos Church number 1. So with her examination of this church, we find her resolving the problem that she had with the New York City skyscrapers. How do you blend the man-made and the organic? Well, in the case of this kind of Adobe style church here, she makes it seem as though this building is like a naturally forming rock outcropping. It is one and the same with the land that it is on. And it is something that continually fascinated her. And so she takes these shapes, she abstracts them just a little bit, but it seems like something that that existed long before man. It seems like something that is triumphant in a very different way than those skyscrapers. Now, there's a lot of serenity in her pictures from the Southwest, particularly early on. She was very drawn to the crosses that she saw throughout New Mexico. Both of these paintings were done in 1929. We have Black Cross, New Mexico on the left, and on the right, Black Cross with stars and blue. So she said, I saw the crosses so often and often in unexpected places, like a thin, dark veil of the Catholic Church spread over the New Mexico desert. And so she's kind of emphasizing this intense spirituality that she saw there. But I mean, that sense of the spiritual was a communion that she felt with the landscape itself. So this seemed like a perfectly natural thing for her to paint. And sort of like the flowers, she's magnifying her subject here. She brings us right in close, and she's abstracting them and she's boiling it down to their essential beauty. I love the blues over here on the right, but I really love these hills that she's included, and that sunset that we see just underneath the cross over here on the left. I think she referred to, or perhaps it was a critic referring to these hills as like miles and miles of gray elephants in the distance, and that description always just stayed with me. So we can see this as a very sort of calm counterpoint to those electrifying skyscrapers that she painted a decade before. Now, I think a very popular image that she created while she was in New Mexico is the Lawrence tree, which was also painted in 1929. And perhaps it's a work that you've seen in person. It's just down at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. She had gone with a few of her friends over to D.H. Lawrence's cabin. Now, he was a writer and a poet, and he often wrote about the dehumanizing effects of modernity and industrialization. So he and Georgio O'Keeffe were very like-minded. And just outside of his cabin door was this huge ponderosa pine. And she laid down on a bench underneath it and composed this scene where the tree branches sort of look like tentacles in many ways. You know, they almost look like they're moving and dancing. And just through the pine needles, we see the night sky with all these stars out. And it transports us immediately to that feeling, to that time, to that place of what it feels like to lie down underneath a tree and to look up. For a moment, nothing else matters. You are like communing with nature in such a powerful way. And she really captures that here with this particular painting. I think that's why so many people really love this image. I mean, it takes you outside. You can smell the air. You can almost feel the dirt underneath your fingers as you look at it. Now, one thing that, and I should note too, that the perspective here is very similar to some of the plays of perspective that she was using back in the 20s when she was looking at skyscrapers. But with the Lawrence tree, things are a little bit different here, because apparently Georgia O'Keeffe was perfectly fine with you hanging this picture in virtually any direction. So if you were to Google this picture, I'll save you the trouble, you'll see that Google Images brings it back in all of these varying orientations. She apparently really likes it in this orientation, and I believe that is how the Wadsworth Athenaeum displays it now. But it's I believe it's technically upside down if you look at it that way. Now she begins spending all of her summers in New Mexico, and this puts a little bit of a strain on her relationship. Her husband's a little terrified that he's losing his wife, and but they find a way to stay connected. Obviously, they really like to write to each other. This is a little note that she left for him. She would hide little love notes all around their apartment for him to discover over the course of her absence. So it just says, "Hello, I kiss you." And what he would do is find it, make a note of where he found it, and then date it. So these things have been recorded for posterity. And in this case, he found it in his slippers. So we have this sense that there is a strain there, and it's not just because of her absence. It's also because Alfred Stieglitz was carrying on a very open affair with another woman. She was a younger woman. She was actually, I think, 7 years younger than his own daughter, and she was also married. Her name was Dorothy Norman, and the affair had started in the 1920s, and the stress of it and the sadness of it ultimately ultimately led to depression and a nervous breakdown for Georgia O'Keeffe, which I think happened around the year of 1933. She was briefly hospitalized. But despite this, and despite the fact that the affair with Dorothy Norman continued on until 1946, when Stieglitz died, O'Keeffe and Stieglitz still remained very closely connected. They were still writing to each other, and he still had enormous control over her and her exhibitions and her career. So perhaps that's why the Southwest was looking so darn appealing to her. It was like a little bit of a way to escape that. So let's go back to New Mexico briefly. Now, other than her flower paintings, O'Keeffe is probably best known as a painter of animal bones. Now, for O'Keeffe, flowers weren't sexual, and to her, bones were not about death. We have to retrain our brains when we look at these. These are not intended to be morbid images at all. We have summer days on the left here, and then on the right, we have Ram's Head, White Hollyhock Hills from 1935. That's at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. Now, you can almost think of these bones and these skulls as functioning like flowers for her in the Southwest. I believe the first summer she was there was a horrible drought, so there were bones everywhere. And she would walk through the fields, picking them up almost as though she was picking flowers. And she would bring them home, and she was really kind of triumphant in collecting them. So to her, they embodied the beauty of this desert landscape, with their weathered surfaces, the rough edges, some of these jagged openings, especially around here, the noses and the mouths. And in these two pictures in particular, you might be thinking a little bit about surrealism. These are unusual compositions with a still life, the animal skulls hovering here in the middle of the air, way over life size, accompanied by a floral still life, but then the desert hills down below. What is this all about? Well, her work was once included in a surrealist exhibition. I think before she even knew what surrealism was. Afterwards, people asked her, "Are you a surrealist?" And she said, "I'm not a joiner," which I really appreciate that response. So she was really adamant in general about not explaining what her works of art meant to other people. She didn't want to discuss what things symbolize. So, I mean, really, it's up to us to kind of sit with these works and think about them, think about how they made us feel. Now, just to give you a sense in terms of her collections here, this is a photograph of her by Ansel Adams, where she's picking up all these bones during a walk in the desert. Look at how happy she is here. And this animal skull still has flesh on it, but she's triumphant. She's bringing it home. And then over here on the right, we can see a little bit of her collections and a skull hanging on the wall here. The photo on the left is from 1937, and the photo on the right is by Todd Webb from 1960s. All right. So in addition to the skulls, she also loved a good pelvic bone. She did a whole series on pelvic bones in the 1940s. We have the Indianapolis Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, and the O'Keeffe Museum from left to right here. And we get a sense in terms of how she really loved to use these works almost like creating a frame to look at the sky. She actually once said that she felt like she could go to prison if she just had a little piece of blue sky to look at. So she is zeroing in on these, zooming in on them, making them monumental in the same way she did with the flowers, emphasizing the simplicity, abstracting them, and then drawing our attention to the beautiful and simple forms that are involved here. And I love how she's kind of framed up the pale moon there. As one art historian describes it, she says, with these works, O'Keeffe demonstrates this idea of seeing the universe through the portal of a bone. So she's doing interesting things in terms of cropping and design here. All ideas coming from that Arthur Wesley Dow. All right. So one last painting from New Mexico here that I don't think she could argue is really about death. We're looking at a head with broken pot from 1943. This is at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. This is a rare instance where we know we're looking at a human bone. We've got a little bit of blue sky stretching out in the background. We've got this little hill of this red-brown earth, and then a skull just staring, smiling right out at us here, missing a lot of teeth, and functioning almost like a helmet here. A broken helmet is a pot that has also been broken itself. Now, she is working within an artistic tradition here called the Vanitas theme, which is oftentimes signified by the use of a human skull in a painting. And that's oftentimes meant to remind us that life is short. And in this case, probably life is a little bit harsh, maybe a little bit violent here too. So the year that she painted this, Georgio O'Keeffe got her first retrospective, and that was at the Art Institute of Chicago, which I'm sure was a real sort of triumph for her, because of course she was a student there and originally from the Midwest. Now, just a few years later, in 1946, her husband Alfred Stieglitz suffers a heart attack, and she immediately goes back to New York City to be with him, and he dies just a few days later. Now, at this point in his life, Dorothy Norman, his lover, was taking care of his gallery, managing a lot of his business affairs. And Georgia O'Keeffe just took it all back and immediately got things in order. One of the first things that she did was take control of his entire body of work. And of about 2,500 photographs that he had to his name, she donated more than half of them to the National Gallery of Art in DC, which was a very wise choice. It sort of cemented his reputation and his legacy. Pretty incredible. So that same year that her husband dies, she gets her first retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, and she's the very first woman to have a retrospective there. So life is continuing on amidst this tragedy. And as she spends the next few years sort of settling his estate, she also buys the ruins of an old hacienda in a town called Abiquiu, New Mexico. These are the ruins of that hacienda on either side. This is a photograph of her from around the same time. And she hires someone to renovate it, and they spend the next 3 or so years developing this property into kind of a little modern retreat. It's about 5,000 square feet, a place where Georgia O'Keeffe would permanently live until for the rest of her life. So let's take a quick look at her house in Abiquiu. This is a peek into her bedroom. This is, of course, a flat kind of Adobe style residence here with these big windows. And then standing in her bedroom, this is the view out of these huge windows that sort of frame up the landscape in the same way that she does, right? Here's a view of her living room. Who wouldn't want to spend time here? This, once again, looks like something that she would want to paint. I want to draw your attention to all of the rocks that she has over here on the windowsill. We'll be getting back to some of these rocks as well. And now let's turn our attention to Georgia O'Keeffe and her multimedia work. We'll sort of move through this quickly in the interest of time. So she's best known as a painter, of course, but we're going to first consider her work with photography. And there is an exhibit of her photographic work at the Addison Gallery at Phillips Academy in Andover, if you're interested in seeing that. I think it just opened this past weekend. Now, it's important to begin by noting that O'Keeffe was one of the most photographed women of the 20th century. And as an artist whose career was launched by kind of racy photos, she became very intentional about the way she was portrayed in photographs during the second half of her life. there was, and there still is, this enormous interest in her appearance, in her clothing, in all of her aesthetic choices. I mean, even in the recipes that she used for cooking. So it's the kind of attention that you don't often see lavished on male artists. And I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, really, but I think it's important to say that in the second half of her life, Georgia O'Keeffe really cultivated the appearance of a serious and solitary individual. And she developed kind of a reputation of being a crabby hermit who lived out in the desert. Now, these two images, this one over here on the left was a photograph for Vogue magazine by Cecil Beaton, 1967. And the image on the right is from right around the same time for Life magazine. And the photographer here is John Loengard. So something changes in her affect, you'll see, when she gets behind a camera. We begin to see her light up. We begin to see her smile. Now, she is someone who, of course, is very familiar with cameras. She was married to a photographer. She was a part of this really influential group of modernist painters and photographers in New York City. But even later in her life, you put a camera in her hand, and I think it just brought her joy. In fact, one of her photographer friends, Todd Webb, said she was like a kid at Christmas, basically, when she got her first Polaroid camera in 1964. So let's sort of see what she does with the camera. Oftentimes she would walk around with fellow photographers and just snap quick pictures of the landscape, like we see in this photograph here. This is another photograph by Todd Webb from 1961. And you can almost think of her snapping these pictures in the same way that she would pick up bones. She was just taking little pieces of this landscape that she loved so much. So let's get a sense of the kinds of photographs that she was creating in this, especially the second half of her career. We have two images here. They're both of a Jimson weed, and over on the left is her painting of a Jimson weed from 1932, and on the right is her photograph of the same subject. It's a Polaroid, and it dates to about 1968. So oftentimes when we're thinking of a painter who also works in photography, we think of the photography as kind of serving as preparation. In this case, it's kind of helping to maybe draw up a memory or just remind her of how she would approach her subjects. It reminds her of the cropping, the framing, the scale that she appreciated when it came to painting flowers here. Now, I should mention that she did not print her pictures to make them look flawless. She wasn't really about that part of the photographic process. She would mostly print contact sheets of all of her negatives, and then she would use them as like bookmarks. These images, in the end, didn't mean so much to her, but the process certainly meant a lot to her. One of her favorite subjects was photographing this door at her hacienda in Abiquiu, New Mexico. She said she bought the ruins of this property because of this door. She said, I'm always trying to paint that door and I never quite get it. She painted this door 22 times after she moved into the property. And we can see from the photographic experiments here that she's just, attempting to see how the door changes when you shift your perspective around a little bit, when there's differences in light. Maybe the shape of the door changes a little bit if you stand a little bit further away. And then we can see that these experiments perhaps do inform some of her paintings that she was doing around the same time. I really love these two paintings. These are Door Through the Window from 1956 and Black Door with Snow from 1955 over here. I think they're both really striking, really simple, very abstract modernist works here. All right, so she also would photograph other things that were hanging around her home. And in particular, this ladder leading up to the roof was a favorite subject for her. We can see she was interested in the shadow. She was interested in the kind of play of these forms. I love how this shadow leads our eye down to this pile of bones over here. How sometimes there's snow on the ground and it changes the tonality of the photograph. And once again, I mean, these almost remind me of like a series of photographs that you might take on your iPhone before you decide which one is your favorite. It's practice. It's an experiment for her in so many ways. So with that, let's turn our attention to her experiments in another form, in the sculptural form. Now, Georgia O'Keeffe was not a prolific sculptor, but she does have a couple of sculptures to her name, and they were forms that she would go back to several times throughout her career. We're looking at her first sculpture called Abstraction. It dates to 1916, and the drawing here is just from the year earlier. You can sort of see that it's a really similar form. There's structure to the vertical part of this. It almost reminds me of like a column in some ways, and then this beautiful curve that reminds me of the top of like a stringed instrument. Here with the sculpture, which is a white lacquered bronze, it's even more simplified. And the way this is oftentimes understood is Georgia O'Keeffe created this immediately following her mother's death. So this is oftentimes seen as like a veiled mourner, somebody with their head hanging low. So whenever I look at that, I think it's such a powerful form there. And so this, it's about 10 inches high, and this version is at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. Perhaps her best known sculpture is this one here, which is called Abstraction. It's also white lacquered bronze, and it was originally modeled in 1946. So right around the time her husband passes away. And it's not exactly a spiral form. It's very close to a spiral form. It's kind of starts off with this circle and then this looping element here, which is like this meaty, sort of beefy, robust form that is in the shape of the number 6. And then it sort of curves back on itself with another circle up above that kind of twists away. It's a beautiful form. And I should say that she creates the maquettes for this, and then she has them cast. She didn't do the castings herself, but she's created this elegant 3-dimensional form, which seems to speak to so many of her painted forms. She loves this sort of looping spiral form, and oftentimes in the same color too. This is Abstraction with White Rose from 1927 over on the left, and on the right we have the white shell with on red from 1938. That's at the Chicago Art Institute. So it's this idea that sort of beguiles her in the same way that perhaps that black door of her home did. Now, she did this sculpture in a couple of different sizes. I think it was 10 inches, 36 inches, and 118 inches. So this is two photographs of her, two very dramatic photographs of her with the very large version of this sculpture. Incidentally, I can't find where these are located today. I would love to see them in person. If anybody knows, please put that in the chat. So one last note about these works. They do so remind me of those studies, those abstracted studies that she created of the view through the holes of the pelvis. She is always kind of finding a way to frame the world in interesting ways. And so with this sculpture, she has created something that you look at and through simultaneously. It's really interesting. So we'll finish up her work in 3 dimensions with a romantic scandal that serves as the bookend for her career. We are looking at her here with a young man in his 20s named Juan Hamilton. And he was really interested in meeting Georgia O'Keeffe, as so many people were. They'd show up at her house in the desert and she wanted nothing to do with them. And so she sent him away and was pretty mad that he came around, but he kept kind of coming around. She took him on as a handyman, and then they had a 13-year relationship where he started off just kind of helping around the house, and then they began to produce art together. He was trained as a potter, and then he really became her companion, and it created a fair amount of controversy because she was 58 years older than him. So let's just take a quick look in terms of what they produced, what she produced. These are his pots over here. This is one of his sculptures, I believe, in the background. But she really kind of came alive making pottery too. This was something she really enjoyed. And she was making forms, developing these forms that were very familiar and similar to shapes and forms that she had been working with in a variety of media throughout her life. So this is one of her pots from the early 80s. This is one of her drawings from the 1960s. It almost looks like a highly polished stone. And Georgia O'Keeffe loved stones almost as much as she loved bones. She had her own collection here. And this is her actually holding out in her hand her absolute favorite stone for one of her photographer friends. So she did a fair amount of pottery in the same vein here, and we can see that I love that they're kind of perfectly imperfect, and they just kind of reflect that smooth form that she was so drawn to with these natural stones that she would find out in the desert. So we'll end this aspect of her career with kind of what happens between her and Juan Hamilton. Here she is sitting in front of a few more of his pots with a delightful smile on her face. Now, Georgia O'Keeffe passes away at the age of 98 in 1986. And at that point, her career, or her estate, I should say, is worth $76 million. And almost all of it is bequeathed to Juan Hamilton, which, as you can imagine, created quite a scandal. And I think it really jump-started a lot of conversations on estate planning in general. Now, he quickly gave back almost everything. And he, today he says he makes his own money. He gets by on his work and his wits, that sort of thing. But he is still closely involved with the estate as a consultant. There's no hard, cold evidence that they were ever actually romantically involved, but there were certainly a lot of whispers about that. Now, pottery probably spoke to Georgia O'Keeffe at the end of her life because she was actually losing her vision. She had macular degeneration, and so her eyesight started to fail as early as the 1960s. And remarkably, by the 1970s, she was creating these very simple gorgeous watercolor paintings that were sort of what she was capable of doing with the eyesight that she had. So these are all from the early 70s, and I believe they're all in the collection of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. Just really sort of simple experiments with color, with form. They're so striking. I think if you're anything like me, it's like I want to pick up some watercolor paints tomorrow and try to recreate them. Now, Georgia O'Keeffe has the pleasure in her life. When you live as long as she did, you have the benefit of being appreciated during your own time. So this is her Presidential Medal of Freedom that she received from Gerald Ford in 1977, incidentally the same year as Norman Rockwell. She also received the National Medal of Arts from Ronald Reagan in 1985, the year before she died. And in addition to that, she was appreciated by a whole wave of feminist artists that came up in the 1970s that began looking back at the history of art and celebrating all of women's contributions, but in this work from an artist named Mary Beth Edelson that's at the Smithsonian, you can see that she is recasting Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper with some living American women artists here, and who's the role of Jesus right at the center of everything. It is Georgia O'Keeffe. She's at the heart of so many things when it comes to women in art in the United States. Judy Chicago, another feminist artist working in the 1970s, created this iconic installation called The Dinner Party, where she created place settings for significant women throughout the history of art. And the women that didn't get place settings, their names are inscribed on the tile in between the space. Everybody sort of has an equal footing at this particular table because it's in a triangle. Nobody's at the head of the table. But Georgia O'Keeffe has this really kind of special table setting that was, of course, inspired by her the forms that she loved when she was at her best. And one last ode to Georgia O'Keeffe that I had to share with you. This was actually done after her death. This is at the Denver Art Museum, done by an artist named David P. Bradley, and it's called O'Keeffe After Whistler. So he's cast the mother of modernism, American modernism, as Whistler's mother here, and he has surrounded her with all of her favorite things: the architecture, the landscape, the crosses, few flowers as well, and with the sort of simple clothing that she was so well known for making. But in the last few years of her life, she wasn't a hermit. She was actually living it up with the likes of Andy Warhol, among others. These are photographs taken by Andy Warhol over here on the left, and then a few more with Andy Warhol on the right. These are from 1980 and 1983, so really right into her 90s. She is rubbing elbows with really influential people in the art world. So as I said, she dies in 1986 at the age of 98. Incidentally, Andy Warhol dies less than a year later. Her body is cremated and the ashes are scattered at one of her homes in New Mexico. And just like Andy Warhol, she has a museum that is dedicated to her artwork. It opened 11 years, well, it was founded 11 years after her death. So now we can all put Santa Fe on our bucket list if you've never been there before. It has a really impressive collection. They're even expanding in the next year or so. And you can go and see these incredible views and this assemblage of some of her collections and her paints here. So we'll end with money, the talk of money, and how her work is valued today. Well, in 2014, the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art bought this painting for $44 million. That Jimson weed that we'd seen before from 1932 sounds like a lot of money, and it is. It was record-breaking for any woman artist in terms of an auction sale, but it still pales in comparison to what male artists get at auction. Her good friend Andy Warhol, his top sales are over 100 million, and the most famous female artist in the world, or at least in America, can only fetch 44 million. I think that says a lot. So we'll end looking at Georgia O'Keeffe from these two separate moments in her life, as a woman in her mid-40s who's heading off to New Mexico, as a woman in her mid-60s who's so well established in New Mexico. And we'll think about this extraordinary woman. She succeeded in a male-dominated industry, and she was eventually able to carve out the life that she desired way out in the desert. During her 7-decade-long career, she created so many iconic works that are still so beloved today. We're doing her legacy a disservice, I think, if we only think of the flowers. So thank you for joining me tonight. I welcome any questions or comments you have about Georgia O'Keeffe. I'll start trying to go through some of these comments in the chat. I'm so happy to see that so many people really like Georgia O'Keeffe. There's a lot to like about these images. Thank you so much for your kind words. This means a lot to me. I see Anne Marie was looking for the red poppy. I'm sorry I didn't include it. I wanted to put every single picture in this program. At one point, I had 100 slides in, and my husband was just laughing at me. And I felt so proud when I got it down to 70 something. So I'm sorry that that not all the favorites were in there, but I hopefully you saw plenty that you really liked. Well, thank you so much for your kind words, everybody. Thank you so much. Well, I hope you can join me for for some of the future programs. Oh, Diane has asked, in what medium did she paint? I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear. These were oil paintings for the most part. We did see some of her watercolors at the end, but she did incredible abstract watercolors in the 19 teens that I think are some of my favorite. I was trying to find a way to work them in, but they didn't quite fit in with my subject headings. But I encourage you to go back and look at her watercolors from early on in her career.
Jane, did you see the, excuse me, the question from Teresa? Where are some of her paintings in this area?
In our area?
Yes.
Oh, that's a good question. There's a painting of a cross that's at the Courier Museum of Art in my hometown. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I'm imagining that the MFA has at least a few of them. I would say like every major museum that has an American art collection has at least a few Georgia O'Keeffe paintings. So I know with my research, I was going a lot to the websites for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So really every major museum with an American collection, you can't go wrong. How was her pottery created? Asked Elaine. I am guessing that it was thrown, but that is just a shot in the dark. That's a very good question. I'm going to have to make sure I'm on that detail for the next time I give this program. You can tell that I don't throw pottery because that wasn't a specific area of inquiry in my mind, but that's a good question, Elaine. She was a woman who was way ahead of her time, wasn't she? It's so interesting because when I started the research for this, I didn't necessarily have a sense of her personality. But I think that wry smile that we started with tonight in one of the title slides, that I really do get the sense that she had a sense of humor. She took herself seriously, she took her work seriously, but she had a sense of humor too, and she had an appreciation for the bigger picture in terms of what she was up against, really. Mary is asking if she did pastels. Mary, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I've seen any. I'll have to go back and look. I can imagine that would fit right into her body of work, but I'm not sure offhand. That's a really good question. I'll have to explore it. Thank you, everybody, for these kind words. Isn't it so interesting? Cheryl mentioned that there was an exhibit at the Peabody Essex that focused on her personal style of clothing. And I know that there were touring exhibitions for like Frida Kahlo and her clothing too. It's so interesting that for female artists, we really think of all of their aesthetic choices as an extension of their creative process. But I can't really think of any male artists where we do the same sort of thing. But there is really something fascinating about Georgia O'Keeffe's fashion choices. Let's see, I keep looking here. Oh, Anne says it looks like it was thrown pottery. She's got some experience with this, so I appreciate you piping in, Anne. Were there any other female artists or photographers she was influenced by? Well, she ran in a very influential circle, and Paul Strand was another very influential artist who was working, or photographer who was working around the same time as her husband. And she spent a lot of time with him, a lot of time with his wife as well. There's a whole book about these two couples and their interactions. So I would say there's probably some influence that way. She was actually friends with Frida Kahlo as well. I mean, she probably knew everybody we could think of in the art world, but it does sort of seem that her particular mode of expression stayed pretty consistent throughout most of her career. So it's hard for me to think like, oh, she might have seen this artist and that changed things. She does stay pretty consistent. But in the 1960s, you see a little bit of color field painting, a little bit more abstraction, which is reflective of what was going on in the art world. I wanted to put in so many of those tonight, but she never, makes a right-hand turn and just starts doing something completely different. Let's see here. Thank you so much for these kind words. And people are filling in a little bit more detail here about one Hamilton. She was 87 years old when she took up pottery with him. We should all be taking up new hobbies in our old age, or even now. Yes. Teresa is asking, do you know if O'Keeffe knew Dorothea Lange, the photographer? That is a really good question. I'd have to look that up. I don't know offhand. And Virginia has added that maybe Salvador Dali's fashion choices might be an interesting exhibit, an extension of his artistic choices. That might be a very interesting collection. I'd be interested in seeing that. All right. Well, I think I've touched on most of them. I can't tell you how much everybody's kind words really mean to me. It's like I ride high for the rest of the week, let me tell you.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
thank you, Jane. It's been such a wonderful series, and it's unbelievable that this was your first time presenting Georgia O'Keeffe Beyond the Blossoms. You've got it down pat. And I
Thank
want to
you.
thank the friends groups of the Burlington Public Library, Tewksbury Public Library, and Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover for generously sponsoring this series. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take good care.
Good
Thank
night.
you.